After that disastrous 8th season of Game of Thrones, I didn't really think that we will ever see another story that runs in the rich, bloody, and intricate world that George R.R. Martin created. But HBO had other ideas, so here we are. I want to be fair and say that House of the Dragon is a much better show than I expected it to be. But as far as expectations and standards go, it has extreme highs and extreme lows. It can be beautiful and sublime and violent, full of tension and drama, but it can be tedious and slow and maybe even boring for a couple of scenes at least. But that last part, I think, has more to do with the expectations we have of what a Game of Thrones story should look and feel, and not with the actual show itself. Before I go on with the breakdown of the show, let's do a rapid fire recap of the first episode, so we are all on the same page. Usually in a TV series, the first scene serves as a setting point for the entire story. Game of Thrones did this, Breaking Bad, it is the norm, and House of the Dragon does it too, starting with what is the most important part of the show, succession, and the war between families that will follow. We fast forward in the future and meet King Viserys making the preparations for the birth of his first son. Among all the celebrations, there will also be a knight's tourney. But everything goes wrong, the queen and the baby die, and the question becomes who will inherit the Iron Throne now that the king has no heir? Could it be the king's daughter, Rhaenyra, a spirited and ambitious young woman, or the king's brother, Daemon, a violent, cunning man that has the command of 1,000 swords as commander of the City Watch? What intricate events and plotlines may happen until we get to that decision? Yeah, there's none of that shit. The king chooses his daughter and that is it, and the episode ends. Shit, that was fast. And it was fast because there were only a couple of truly interesting things that happened in the first episode. The knight's tourney, the failed birth of the king's son, and the subsequent choice that he has to make. Save his son or bet that his wife will be able to deliver the baby. And that's about it, really. Nothing else was compelling and interesting enough in the entire first episode. The main characters and their storylines seem a bit formulaic and one-sided. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for this, and I will get to the meat of the episode in a moment. But I think I have to point out that the House of the Dragon is based not on a fictional story, like the Song of Ice and Fire, where the characters and their stories were written in advance by George R.R. Martin, but on Fire and Blood, the history book about Westeros. So I haven't read Fire and Blood, so I could be way off in some things I say here, but I think the show is too loyal to the source material. Understandable, of course, no one wants a repeat of Season 8 of Game of Thrones, but the characters in House of the Dragon don't seem to have the space and the time to grow organically. The showrunners already know what's going to happen from Fire and Blood, so they move characters from one place to another hastily with little thought of how they got there and what decisions were made in the meantime. It's almost like they treat their characters not as people in this fictional story, but as pieces on a chessboard to be used as they see fit. I have seen 5 episodes so far, and although the show does have some good things about it, it somehow feels off, like we're watching a copy of a story that we used to know and love, an imitation of sorts that has never reached even the lowest part of the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. And I want to take the time in this video and explain why House of the Dragon isn't as good as Game of Thrones. You see, House of the Dragon is a much more contained story than Game of Thrones. There are no sprawling storylines scattered in the far sides of the world. There are no extremes, there is no ice wall and the harsh conditions and even harsher people that lived around it. And there is no desert and the desperation and the potential that existed within that storyline with Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. And far more importantly, there are no underdogs in House of the Dragon. None whatsoever. There are no characters that have simple wants and needs. The main characters of the House of the Dragon, King Viserys, Rhaenyra, and Daemon, and almost all the rest of the secondary ones, are all rich and privileged and in one way or another very powerful. And that makes them safe and the story they inhabit much less interesting and compelling. It's difficult to care about characters if what they want to achieve is shallow and superficial, and their whole character's journey isn't about how superficial their needs are and what can they do to overcome them, but instead their character's arc is about how great it would be for just getting what they want sitting in the Iron Throne, be the boss, be the ultra-powerful leader of Westeros. But the thing is, this is a story about an extended family of rich people fighting for the top seat. The stakes of the story are external. They are not tied to a deep internal desire that Rhaenyra or Daemon might have, at least for now. Their desire for the Iron Throne is just another thing that they want to tick off their list. And all of that just doesn't sound all that compelling. In the brutal and savage world of Westeros, who has the power and how they decide to yield it is kind of a big deal, and we tend to like and love characters that lack power and aren't completely control of their fate, especially if their goals are intertwined with their deepest desires, like finding your way in the world. Of course, I'm talking about underdogs. Which characters we like and which we don't, what storylines we find compelling can make or break a story, and I want to explain what a good character is. A good example is Jon Snow. He was the son of a lord and lived in a castle, but he was a bastard and had no rights and by extension no future, and that is what drove him to the wall. He started low with basically nothing, except maybe his training and experience that the Maesters gave him, and he had to rise through the ranks, make people respect him by his actions alone, and get to a point where being commander of the Watch afforded him a certain amount of power and safety. Okay, for a bit at least, we all know how that turned out. He was an easy character to like. We tend to respect and adore underdogs. They start from the bottom and they have to scrape and fight to rise to a better position. Game of Thrones was full of underdogs. Tyrion, Sam, Arya, even Daenerys Targaryen starts as a princess in name only, as someone with no army, no dragons, no power at all, and her brother sells her to a local warlord in exchange for an army. Now, let's compare these characters with the one in House of the Dragon. Well, they are all soaring high when we meet them. I mean, literally. The first time we meet Princess Rhaenyra, she's flying her dragon. She's a privileged princess that has everything. Daemon is also a prince who is in command of thousands of men. I suppose the most likable of the three main characters is King Viserys, who is portrayed as an everyday man trapped in the role of a king. But the other two, Rhaenyra and Daemon, have the same goal. They want the Iron Throne, but that is something they want to achieve. It's not who they are as people, as characters. And do their actions in these first episodes betray maybe some hidden inner goal that they might have, I wonder? What does Rhaenyra do in this first episode? She knows that her father must make a choice of who will be the next leader of Westeros. Will it be her or Daemon? After knowing all of that, does she do anything to influence the succession her way? Does she try to manipulate her father? Talk to the other lords perhaps? Does she do anything at all that shows a tiny bit of her character? The answer is no, she does nothing. Rhaenyra just fusses and moans with her friend Alicent, and then she gets handed the Iron Throne in the end of the episode. That is a terrible way to introduce a character, to just give them what they want without any real conflict. But I know what you'll say. No, your take is all wrong. The actual conflict of the episode was who amongst Rhaenyra and Daemon will King Viserys choose to be the next leader of Westeros. I don't really think there was ever an actual dilemma for Viserys, and I think it has to do with how Daemon is presented to us as a character right from the first time we meet him. He's a sadistic and cruel commander that cuts the hands of thieves. He makes jokes about the death of the king's baby son and hangs out in brothels. He's presented to us as a one-sided character, a monstrous facade of a man, because I think the show desperately wanted to paint him as a bad guy. We rarely see things from his point of view. We only get glimpses of who he might actually be. Most likely, this was done to paint him in a crude way as an antagonist, because the show doesn't have any, not really. That's why all the scenes that Daemon is in is shown to us from an outside perspective. The villainous, sinister, stone-faced brother of the king that only wants the Iron Throne and nothing else. And even if you take the scene where Daemon talks shit about the death of the king's baby son as something more, as a more complicated and layered side to his character, because we see him drinking beforehand, and maybe he was sulking because he wanted to mask his pain, but he actually cared about the death of the king's son, because the baby, after all, was his nephew. Now, I don't think that's enough to let us inside to his character, so we can see who Daemon really is. And in the following episodes, we see the exact same thing happening again and again, where Matt Smith has to show a different side to his character, but he only has a moment to do so. He doesn't get scenes with someone to talk to reveal his feelings, his wants and needs. He has a couple of scenes with his girlfriend, but those scenes are short, and they don't really push his character forward. Now, after the show has spent all this time showing us how bad Daemon is, of course the king would choose his own daughter. How else could he have given the crown such a blood-hungry man as Daemon? For us, the audience, that wouldn't have made any sense, because we were presented with basically one choice. For him to give the crown to Daemon would be absurd. At some point in the first episode, we learn that King Viserys has a skin disease that eats away his flesh, so immediately that puts a clock on everything, because we know that most likely that disease will kill him, and all the things in the show are hastened by the little time that he has left. Now let's move on to the second episode. The show desperately wants to have someone to go against our main characters, the Targaryens. So now we have this empty threat coming from far away with this new bad guy called the Crab Feeder, a pirate general of sorts that feeds the enemy soldiers to the crabs. And I call him an empty threat because we don't have scenes with him to get to know him as a character, to understand what he wants, what his plan may be. All of that is missing. He's just a Sadway, but probably a very real threat. The king and his council debate if they should send an army to deal with him, but the king doesn't want to get embroiled in a war. This scene is a bit interesting because it shows Rhaenyra trying to give her take on what should be done with this pirate king, but the council shuts her down just because she's a woman. Now, as character work, this works just fine, but Rhaenyra isn't trained in strategy and war, and because she's a teenager, she has no experience with politics and difficult decisions either. So I think the lords not letting her speak is probably more complicated than the show lets on. Not many interesting things happen in this episode. Rhaenyra chooses a handsome knight, Ser Criston Cole, as her guard because she has the hots for him, I guess, and the rest of the episode is just blunt melodrama. After those first 10 minutes, we see two main plot lines. One is, now that the queen has passed, the question becomes who will be the king's next bride, and the show is bogged down in these slow, bride-seeking, no stakes at all scenes, until the king finally decides to redeem us from this never-ending soap opera torture and finally marry Alicent, the daughter of the Hand of the King. I mean, seriously, this bride-seeking plotline belongs in a Disney movie, one that possibly revolves around a missing young woman with one shoe that disappears at midnight and is afraid of her evil stepmother, and not in a story that is set in the violent and unforgiving world of Westeros. And the second plotline is when Daemon steals a dragon's egg and Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, alongside with a small dispatch of men, is sent to Dragonstone, to Daemon's castle, to retrieve it. But again, little thought has gone through on making this sequence. I mean, the Hand of the King has taken only a handful of men with him, despite him knowing that since Daemon has gone through all this trouble of stealing the egg, he might go through the trouble of fighting for it. And we have already established from the first episode that Daemon is in command of thousands of men. Not only he could easily decide to send them to cut down the tiny little army that is at his gates, but we find out also that he has a big-ass dragon, one that everyone thought was lost, wandering somewhere in Westeros, but I guess he found him somehow, and now it belongs to him. But the tension in this scene doesn't last long. Rhaenyra comes along with her own dragon and saves the day, a bit manipulating to show us early in the episode men talking down to Rhaenyra, but here she is now, saving the day. The episode ends with Lord Corlys and Daemon going in an alliance together to defeat the Pirate King, the Crab Feeder. Corlys has too much invested in the shipping lanes to just stand at the sidelines until the king makes up his mind, and their decision to go to war leads us to episode 3. Here we finally meet this dreaded Pirate King, the Crab Feeder, as someone who is disfigured, probably burned, most of his face is covered, and yeah, he looks badass, at least in a bad guy of the week way. And I say that because, once more, we are presented with this paper-thin, one-sided facade of this character, with no layers at all. I'm not sure if he even speaks throughout the episode. Daemon flies down with his dragon, but he can do little to burn away the Crab Feeder and his men, because they hide away in their caves and they shoot arrows at him, so it's basically a stalemate. Things happen very fast in House of the Dragon. In a single episode, 2 years has passed and Queen Alicent has borne the king a son. Episode 3 is by far the best so far, because in House of the Dragon, the main plot lines delve into petty politics and family feuds. The show doesn't have clear antagonists that will go against our main characters and actually threaten them. But now we finally do have an antagonist, and the reason why this episode is so much better than the rest is because it forces our characters into making difficult choices and taking action. Now that the king has a son, he has to make a choice. Either he keeps supporting his daughter Rhaenyra to be the one in line for the throne, or choose his newborn son. If he does the latter, he will appease the lords that want the succession to take a more traditional route and have a male heir for next in line to the throne. Having a queen is not the norm in the world of Westeros, at least in this particular time, and the lords fear it will bring instability and may lead to war. Viserys is someone who is just a normal guy that just happened to be born a king. He just wants to have his drink in peace, have some fun with friends and maybe go on to a hunt. But the king is so burdened by the succession drama and the constant nagging by Rhaenyra and his lords that when he finally does go to the hunt, he doesn't enjoy it at all. We see how he doesn't really want to kill the animal, and he succumbs to the peer pressure of all the people around him. In the question of who the king will choose for the next ruler of Westeros, Rhaenyra or his son Aegon, I think there's a deeper or maybe even a hidden meaning. I think the king doesn't really have a choice but Rhaenyra, because as we have established, the king is dying, his skin disease is eating away at him. If he chooses his baby son for an heir, then dies, how the hell can he trust all those manipulative, conniving lords around the palace that they will protect the boy until he comes of age and become a king? By putting Rhaenyra as heir, he's protecting his son because he knows that she will protect him as her baby brother. In the end, he'll be safe. Although the later part of the episode is much better, again we have to suffer another plotline full of innate gossip, teenage angst, and really almost a story with little to no stakes at all. Because the question we are faced is who will be the one that Rhaenyra will marry now that she's of a marrying age. Rhaenyra fucking hates all those grooms coming to her, so she just escapes to the woods with her bodyguard, Sir Criston Cole, and they basically have a little adventure with some romantic undertones. The show has spent a good deal of time having characters all the time talking down to Rhaenyra, and I think it is aware that she doesn't really have a lot of redeeming qualities, so they desperately want to find ways to make her look as someone that is competent and somewhat strong. So the show chooses to have a wild boar attack them at night. Of course, Rhaenyra comes up on top, and when she comes back to the camp all bloody, with the boar hanging behind her horse, in essence, all those would-be grooms can see that she doesn't need any of them. She can be a strong and capable leader just by herself. Which, it's fine and all that, but again, it feels a bit manipulative. Especially when she goes through all of that and she doesn't suffer any consequences. She doesn't get beaten or hurt in any way. Everything just works out for her. Also, just a side note here. Why the hell does Criston Cole, the bodyguard, hangs around in the forest next to Rhaenyra without wearing his armor? What if someone comes along? What then, motherfucker? Alright, I forgot. Plot armor. But yeah, he wasn't wearing his armor because they want to set up the scene where they have sex in the next episode. Whatever. At the final part of the episode, the king sends 2,000 men to help Daemon and Lord Corlys in their fight against the Pirate King. This was the first time we see actual, meaningful character work on Daemon. The war wasn't really going his way, and when the king's messenger arrives and gives him the news that the king has sent reinforcements, he lashes out on the messenger, just hitting him and fucking him up. Now, there's no mystery why Daemon did that. He was always in his brother's shadow. Viserys is king, and he isn't. Daemon wanted to win the war by himself, but now the king's reinforcements serves as a reminder that he will always be second fiddle, no matter what, and he doesn't exactly take that all too well. The action sequence that follows is quite good. We see that Daemon is so desperate to prove himself that he barges in battle with no backup, at least until the crab feeder and his men take the bait, get out of their caves and become easy prey for Daemon's dragon. It's not exactly clear why Daemon and his army had any trouble with the crab feeder. The show tells us that they are hiding in their caves and Dragonfire can't reach them. Okay, but even if the caves are big enough for that to happen, they still are on an island. Just burn their ships and let them starve to death. What's the problem? Unless, of course, the island is much bigger than the show has let on, so I guess that's okay. If Damon doesn't have the ships to patrol, he can't enforce the blockade, but having a dragon could certainly make things much easier. Also, a couple of details here. What the hell is going on with Damon's armor? We see arrows piercing it like it was made for butter. May I remind you that the show is based somewhat on medieval history, and if we take on what actually happened in battles at that time, was that the knights ditched their shields and started wearing armor because arrows and swords couldn't go through it. The armor was that good. Damon is rich as fuck. The arrows shouldn't even be able to make a scratch on his armor, not even pierce it. Come on now. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to episode 4. Now, I'm gonna be honest here and say the best part of the whole episode is the piano music at the very first seconds when Rhaenyra interviews possible husbands. And it's the best part, one, because it reminded me of the piano music from Game of Thrones Season 6, just before the wildfire erupted. Awesome scene, by the way. And second, because nothing, absolutely nothing interesting happens in this episode. As I have already said, because the stakes are too low, and because there are no underdogs and no antagonists, the show veers too much on a melodrama soap opera mix. Granted, it's a very well done melodrama, but still. The second episode was about who will the king marry. The first part of the third episode was who will Rhaenyra marry, and the fourth episode is about who will Rhaenyra have sex with. Will it be, oh my god, her uncle Daemon? Who would have thought we would see incest in a Game of Thrones story? Or would she go maybe for the dashing, tall, dark and handsome Sir Criston Cole? She chooses the second. Then the question becomes, is she pregnant? And how is this possible pregnancy will affect the succession? I mean, what the fuck? We are in the world of Westeros, and from all the myriad of stories that the show could tell, you're going for privileged teenage angst melodrama of who will she choose to have sex with and if she's pregnant or not. Fuck off, really, fuck off. And furthermore, I want to address how the show is again trying to manipulate us to liking Rhaenyra by having men talking down to her and her father not letting her choose who she will have sex with and who she will marry. These undertones of misogyny are a bit out of place, and I don't think they work as much as the show would like them to. Because the show is trying to depict Rhaenyra as someone who's being forced to choose a husband, and that choice is somewhat linked to the loss of freedom for her. But let's not forget that Rhaenyra is one of the most powerful people in all of Westeros. She has a fucking dragon, and very soon, most likely, she will be queen and command entire armies. Obviously, it's not good or ethical that she doesn't get to choose who she will exactly marry, but the thing is, whoever it is, that marriage will be a sham. Whatever happens, Rhaenyra will still have all the power. She will still be rich and powerful. She will still be a princess and later on a queen. Now, allow me to go for a tangent for a moment. Let's suppose House of the Dragon wanted to show the misogyny of a medieval society, but instead of following a powerful teenage princess that chooses to have a wild night out, we follow just a normal girl, maybe the daughter of a ship herder or an iron forger perhaps, someone who isn't rich or a lord, doesn't have armies or mercenaries at their beck and call, someone that doesn't have power, and in extension, his daughter doesn't have power either. Think of how powerful that scene would be if that teenage girl, now after that wild night out, she's not a virgin anymore, and by the fucked up standards of the day, has to marry some old creepy guy, or her father sells her for a couple of goats to some guy just to get rid of her because she has offended his sense of honor. There would be nothing that girl can do to change her fate, and dramatically it would work very well because her dad isn't the king and she doesn't have a dragon to burn her creepy husband. But in Rhaenyra's story, she goes out, she has her fun, but what are the consequences of her actions? Is she forced to a marriage? Is she beaten? Is she sent away to some convent in the middle of nowhere? No, none of that happens. There are no consequences. The maester gets her a cup of special tea so she won't get pregnant, and that's about it. We are 4 episodes in, and I'm surprised how long and drawn out scenes are, and rarely there's any actual substance in them. We are being told, for example, that Lord Corlys is about to marry his son, Laenor, to some rich woman across the narrow sea, and a good match for Rhaenyra is about to be lost. And I'm like, why is the show telling us all of that instead of showing us to us? And give the characters that haven't much screen time until now, like Laenor and Corlys, the time to grow and show us who they truly are. There are small things that happen throughout the episode. Daemon wants to marry Rhaenyra, King Viserys firing Otto Hightower from the position of the Hand of the King, but these scenes have very little dramatic value and happen so often throughout the season that I have not mentioned several of them in those first 5 episodes because I didn't want to repeat myself. But in general, scenes like that feel like chess pieces moving on a board and not something that has actual consequences for its characters. They serve more as a setting point for something that will happen several episodes later on. Now let's move on to episode 5. I feel that House of the Dragon is so desperately in need of conflict, war, and violence in order to leave the family drama and petty politics aside and somehow hype up the tension and become engaging and entertaining, that it pushes events and scenes, set a stage that otherwise would have been just background noise. Of course, I'm talking about the marriage party, where Criston Cole kills Lord Laenor's lover. If this was any Game of Thrones episode, this scene would be just a brief mention, a throwaway line that someone says when visiting a brothel perhaps. But in House of the Dragon, we get a full, long, drawn-out sequence. This is another example of low-stakes drama that basically belongs in another genre, and not something that deserves to be on a Game of Thrones story. Think about it. What happened here is that one secret lover kills another secret lover. I mean, another title for this episode would be The Battle of the Spurned Lovers, and that might as well be the title of a romance novel that a love-hungry lady might buy on Amazon for sale. I mean, for fuck's sakes. One toy boy kills another toy boy while Daemon comes to convince Rhaenyra to sleep with him, and she doesn't give a fuck, she's daring him to kidnap her and marry her by force. All this shit is way too much balanced romance / melodrama / soap opera. Actually, come to think of it, privileged out-of-touch royals that don't give a single fuck for the lives of other people but their own little drama. Damn, House of the Dragon is basically The Crown, but with dragons. Alright, in all seriousness, this isn't the direction that I hope the show would take. Now, by my criticism, you might think that I believe the show isn't good. No, not at all. I just think that with some slight changes in the story and characters, the show could have been much better. But I think this is the problem so far. It's kind of obvious that the creators were so afraid of the show failing, they didn't want another season 8 of Game of Thrones. So they took George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood and kept the plot and characters very close to the source material. However, by doing that, they bring forward small events with little dramatic importance, and they're not giving our main characters, or not even our secondary characters, time to breathe and grow in an organic way, because all their stories are pre-written and events must unfold in the exact way, or at least come very close to the manner as they were written in Fire and Blood. And oftentimes the show doesn't properly set things up, so they can come back in a later episode for the payoff. For example, the episode starts with Daemon going to Runestone to meet his estranged wife, and let me just add here that with his black hood tucked so low and grim expression, Daemon is looking very close to Anakin Skywalker going to the dark side. As we find later on, Daemon's overall goal is to kill his wife in order to get her fortune, but none of that is set up in the previous episodes. And that doesn't really make any sense. Why the hell don't we get scenes from Daemon's point of view to learn about his plan about Runestone, or at least be aware of it, even by a throwaway line, so we can be allowed to speculate of what he actually wants. His wife dies and I'm like, okay, that happened I guess. It can be said that Daemon's true goal was to convince Rhaenyra to marry him by ditching his wife. But again, so what? Things happen so fast that they don't really have any dramatic importance. They don't have any weight behind them. If there was a subplot where Daemon was planning to kidnap Rhaenyra in order to marry her, and the killing and the general commotion at the marriage party messed up his plan, I would be, okay, yeah, that works just fine. But the scene where he comes to Rhaenyra and asks her to marry him has all the drama swept off its feet by the murder that happens. Also, I quite liked the scene with Otto Hightower telling his daughter Alicent that when Rhaenyra has children with Lord Laenor, Alicent's children are basically fucked, because they would always be a threat for the succession. And that pushes Alicent to act, and we have an alliance with a spurned lover, Criston Cole. So far, Otto Hightower and Criston Cole are the only characters that have some decency in them. And it would be interesting to see what their character's arc would be. At least for Criston Cole, he gets the wrong end of the deal here, and it would be perfectly normal for him to hold a grudge against Rhaenyra after rejecting him like that. I'm gonna stop here for now, because episode 6 was released and the show jumped 10 years in the future and basically rebooted itself. I was only half kidding about the show being The Crown but with dragons, but now I see that the similarities in those two are so great that cannot be missed. The big time jumps across episodes and seasons, how its characters are portrayed. It's kind of like if you see it, you can't unsee it. But anyway, I'll touch more on all of that on part 2. Also, if you made it this far, like the video, subscribe, leave a comment, all of that.